When he arrived, nothing looked broken, nothing looked disturbed, and nothing looked abandoned in the way abandoned places usually do. The village looked as if ordinary life had been stopped in the middle of itself. Asterisk, the village that went quiet. He reached the place expecting warmth, noise, and people, but what he found instead was a village that looked as if everyone had simply stood up and left in the middle of their lives. At first, the emptiness could still be explained, but the longer he stayed, the more the small, ordinary details began to feel carefully and deliberately wrong. The river was low for that time of year, and the canoe scraped stone more often than he liked as he guided it toward the narrow shore. He had been traveling for days through country that did not offer much except cold air and long stretches of silence, and he was counting on the settlement ahead for food and rest rather than comfort. Smoke had been visible from far away, a thin line against a pale sky, and that alone had been enough to keep him moving. When he stepped onto the frozen ground, he noticed how still everything was. Not the natural stillness of wilderness, but the quiet of a place that had recently been used and then forgotten. He walked between the small buildings and saw doors that were not fully closed and tools that had been left where hands would easily find them again. Inside one shelter, a pot sat over a fire that had burned down to ash, and food had been left as if someone intended to return within minutes. In another, a coat lay folded over a chair, and the floor beneath it was clean, as though it had been swept that same morning. There were no tracks leading away, no sign of hurried packing, and no sign of struggle. It felt less like a place abandoned and more like a place paused. At first he told himself that the people were simply away, hunting or traveling, and that he had arrived at an inconvenient hour. He waited and listened, but the only sounds were the wind and the distant movement of ice along the shore. As he continued to search, he noticed the dogs tied near the edge of the village, thin and weak, some of them barely moving. Their bowls were empty, yet nearby storage sheds still held food. The contrast unsettled him more than the silence, because it suggested not neglect over time, but something that had interrupted a routine. He moved toward the burial ground out of a sense of duty rather than curiosity, and there he found the ground disturbed in a way that did not fit with weather or animals. Several places were open where the earth should have been smooth and settled, and the markers had been placed carefully to one side instead of knocked over. There were no signs of digging tools, no footprints that made sense, and no indication of how long the ground had been that way. The air felt heavier there, not because of any clear danger, but because nothing he saw could be placed into a simple explanation. By the time the light began to fade, he had gathered what supplies he could without touching anything that felt too personal, and he returned to his canoe with a growing sense that staying longer was a mistake. As he pushed off and followed the river back into open water, he looked once more at the shoreline and noticed a faint, distant glow beyond the hills, something that had not been there before, and he realized he could not say whether it was part of the sky, the land, or something else entirely at first. The silence could still be explained, but the longer the place was examined, the more it became clear that this was not the kind of emptiness that happens by accident. Asterisk at first, the emptiness could still be explained, but the longer anyone stayed, the more the small, ordinary details began to feel carefully and deliberately wrong. What had looked like simple absence slowly started to resemble something that had been interrupted and never allowed to finish. He did not speak much about what he had seen when he finally reached other people, but he spoke enough to make them uneasy. The story moved the way such stories usually do, quietly at first, passed along between men who spent their lives traveling through wide and empty places, and then a little louder when it reached those who kept records and asked questions. No one argued with the simple facts of it, only with what they might mean, and for several weeks nothing happened at all. Then a small group set out to see the place for themselves, not because they expected to find answers, but because leaving a question like that, alone in the wilderness, felt like an unfinished task. The journey took longer than planned, and by the time they reached the lake, the weather had already turned harsher, pressing the land into a kind of quiet that made every sound seem out of place. From a distance, the village looked much the same as it had been described, a scatter of low buildings against pale ground, with no movement and no smoke. Up close, the sense of recent use was still there, even after time and cold had begun to work on everything. Snow had drifted into open doorways, but it had not yet covered the marks of daily life. A broken sled lay where it might have been set down for repair, and inside one of the huts, thread and cloth were still arranged as if someone had simply stood up and stepped outside. They moved slowly, not out of fear, but out of the feeling that speed would somehow be disrespectful to a place that had not been given a chance to close itself properly. In several shelters, they found the same quiet signs of interruption: meals that had never been eaten, storage left open, and beds that looked as though they had been left in the middle of being used. Nothing suggested panic, and nothing suggested planning either. It was this lack of any clear direction that began to weigh on them, because people normally leave some kind of trace of intention behind. Near the edge of the settlement, they found the dogs again, or what remained of them, and the sight made the air feel colder. The animals had not wandered off, and they had not been freed, and yet they had clearly been left without care. Nearby, supplies still sat in places where anyone could have reached them. It was one of those details that refused to fit into any reasonable explanation, and no one tried very hard to force it to. When they reached the burial ground, they saw that time had not changed what had been reported. The ground was still opened in careful, deliberate ways, and the markers were still arranged to one side, as if someone had taken the trouble to keep them from being damaged. There were still no signs of tools or of any simple method. One of the men stood for a long time without speaking, looking at the smooth edges of the disturbed earth, and then turned away as if he had decided not to finish a thought. They did not stay long after that, and as they prepared to leave, one of them noticed, far beyond the lake and the low hills, a faint and steady light that did not flicker like fire and did not move like the sky. And for a moment, none of them could agree on whether it had been there all along. Asterisk. What made people uneasy was not what they found in the village, but how consistently everything looked as if it was still waiting to be used again. Asterisk days later, others followed the same path, and each of them noticed the same quiet signs that suggested whatever happened there did not happen in a hurry. The place did not feel damaged or destroyed, only carefully and completely left behind. The reports that came back were written in calm, practical language, but when read together, they formed a picture that was difficult to ignore. Each group described the same arrangement of objects, the same unfinished tasks, and the same absence that felt less like departure and more like an interruption. Some stayed only a few hours, others stayed longer, but none of them stayed through the night. They said there was no clear reason for leaving so quickly, only a sense that the place did not behave like other empty places, as if it resisted being understood in ordinary terms. What began to stand out were not the big details, but the small ones. A cup placed upside down beside a cold stove, a stack of cut wood that had been sorted by size, as though someone had been in the middle of planning the next few days. A door that had been carefully tied open, not to keep it from closing in the wind, but in a way that suggested someone had expected to walk back through it. None of these things meant anything on their own, but together they formed a pattern of ordinary life that had been stopped without warning and without any sign of urgency. One of the men who returned from the village tried to explain it by comparing it to walking into a room just after someone had left, except that no one ever came back. He said the air felt used, as if it still remembered voices and movement, even though there were none. Others did not like that way of describing it, and preferred to keep their reports limited to what could be measured and seen. But even they could not avoid mentioning how often they found themselves listening for sounds that never came. As more time passed, stories from nearby travelers began to collect around the edges of the official accounts. Some spoke of distant lights seen on clear nights, far out over the land where there were no settlements and no known routes. Others spoke of moments when their compasses behaved strangely, or when familiar paths felt slightly longer than they should have been. None of these things could be directly connected to the empty village, and most of them were dismissed as the kind of observations people make when they already feel uncertain. But the timing made them difficult to completely ignore. A few people tried to approach the place alone, without writing reports or telling anyone exactly when they would return. They usually did not stay long, and when they came back, they spoke less than those who had gone in groups. One of them said that he had the strong and persistent feeling of being watched, not in a way that suggested danger, but in a way that suggested attention, as if the empty buildings themselves were keeping track of him. He admitted that he could not explain what had given him that impression, and he did not try to. Over time, the village began to appear less in practical discussions and more in quiet conversations. The kind that happen when people are trying to decide whether something belongs in the world they understand, or in the part of it they prefer not to think about too much. And then, during one of the colder months, a traveler returned from the region and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he had seen faint lights near the lake again, closer this time than anyone remembered before. Different travelers told different stories, but every single one of them described the same feeling, that the place was not only empty, but somehow unwilling to be approached. Stories from nearby travelers did not match, but they all shared one uncomfortable detail that no one could fully explain or ignore. The place was not only empty, it seemed to resist being approached in any ordinary way. By the time another small expedition was organized, the village had already begun to exist more in reports than in memory, and that made everyone more careful about what they expected to find. The men who went this time were not looking for answers so much as consistency, something that could be written down and compared without adding new questions. The journey itself felt longer than it should have, even to those who knew the region well, and they reached the lake later in the day than planned, with the light already starting to thin. From a distance, the settlement still looked unchanged, but when they walked among the buildings, they noticed how time had begun to soften the edges of everything, without really erasing the sense of interruption that hung over the place like a held breath. They worked methodically, noting what had shifted and what had not, and the balance between those two things was what troubled them most. Snow had moved, wood had cracked, and small animals had begun to leave their marks. Yet many objects were still exactly where earlier visitors had described them. A table still held an empty cup turned on its side, and a bundle of firewood still leaned against a wall in careful order. In one shelter, a piece of cloth was still pinned in place, and the thread beside it had not been disturbed by wind or by time in any way that made sense. It was as if the place allowed certain changes and refused others, and no one could decide what rule, if any, guided that difference. Near the edge of the village, they found something new, or at least something that had not been mentioned before. A narrow line in the ground that ran from one of the buildings toward the open land beyond. It was not deep, and it could have been made by many ordinary things, but it did not match any track they recognized, and it did not continue in any clear direction once it left the settlement. They followed it for a while, and then lost it among rocks and frozen soil, and the fact that it did not lead anywhere made it feel more deliberate rather than less. No one suggested writing that thought down, but all of them were thinking it, They stayed until the light was nearly gone. And in those last hours, the lake took on a flat, metallic look that made distances hard to judge. As they prepared to leave, one of them noticed a faint glow far beyond the hills, steady and pale, not moving in any way that suggested fire or reflection. At first it seemed too far away to matter, but as they watched, it appeared to grow slightly brighter, or perhaps only more distinct, and for a moment none of them could say whether it was approaching, or whether their eyes were simply adjusting to the dark. Asterisk. By the time the pattern could no longer be ignored, the village no longer felt like a place people had left, but like a place that had been carefully cleared. Asterisk. By the time the pattern became clear, it was already impossible to look at the place as abandoned in any normal sense of the word. What had once seemed like absence now felt more like a deliberate and careful removal. After the last expedition, the reports were no longer treated as separate accounts, but as parts of a single, slowly forming picture. When the notes were placed side by side, certain details repeated too often to be ignored. The same objects that never seemed to move, the same strange balance between decay and preservation, and the same distant lights that appeared only when the day was ending. None of these things could be proven to mean anything, but together they created a rhythm that felt intentional, as if the place itself was following a schedule that no one could see. A few officials suggested that the village should be left alone, not because of danger, but because there was nothing practical left to be learned there. Yet even they could not fully explain why they felt that way. One last visit was planned, quieter than the others, and without much public attention, with the simple goal of closing the matter in a formal sense. The men who went carried better equipment and more time, and they intended to stay overnight, something no one had done before. When they arrived, the settlement looked much as it always had, slightly more worn, slightly more covered by snow, but still holding on to the same unsettling signs of interrupted life. They chose one of the larger shelters to use as a base and moved the least they could, as if touching things too much might erase something they were still trying to understand. As the day passed, they worked through the village in a careful and almost quiet way, checking and rechecking details that had already been recorded. It was in the late afternoon that one of them noticed something that did not fit with earlier descriptions. Near the burial ground, where the earth had been disturbed long ago, the surface now looked smoother, not as if it had healed naturally, but as if someone had taken time to make it even. The markers were still arranged to one side, but their positions were slightly different, not enough to suggest wind or animals, but enough to suggest a decision. No one said it out loud, but all of them understood that this meant something in the village had changed without any of them being there to see it. When the light began to fade, they returned to their shelter and prepared for the night. The cold came in slowly, settling into the walls and the floor, and the lake outside grew quiet in a way that made even small sounds seem too loud. For a long time, nothing happened, and they began to think that the unease they felt was only the result of too many stories and too much expectation. Then, just before full darkness, one of them stepped outside and noticed the same pale glow beyond the hills, brighter now than any of them had seen it before, steady and without any clear source. They stood together and watched it, trying to decide whether it was moving or whether the land itself was playing a trick on their eyes. And that was when they realized that the village, which had always felt empty, now felt as if it were waiting, years later, with nothing left but records and quiet memories. The question was no longer what happened there, but whether the village had ever truly been allowed to stay. Even now, with nothing left but reports and memories. The question remains whether the village was truly left behind, or if it was taken in a way no one could prove. What people remember most is not what was found there, but what never returned. They did not stay long after that final night, and there was no announcement when the place was quietly marked, and set aside as something no longer worth visiting. The men who had gone came back with careful notes and tired expressions, and for a while those notes were read and compared in offices that smelled of paper and cold air. Nothing in them could be argued with, and nothing in them could be used to reach a conclusion that felt complete. The glow beyond the hills was mentioned, but only as a visual detail, the way one might mention weather, and the small changes in the burial ground were recorded without comment. The village became a file, and then a name, and then a story people told each other when work was slow. Over the years, the land did what it always does, and the edges of the settlement softened until paths were harder to find, and buildings became less distinct against the ground. Travelers still passed nearby, but fewer of them felt any reason to stop, and those who did usually left with the same quiet feeling that they had interrupted something without understanding it. From time to time, someone would mention seeing a distant light, or feeling that familiar routes had subtly shifted, but these remarks were never written down in the same way the early reports had been. They stayed in conversations, where they could fade or change without anyone noticing. What remained most consistent was the way people spoke about the place, not with excitement or fear, but with a kind of careful distance. It was always described as empty, never as ruined, and always as quiet, never as destroyed. Some suggested ordinary explanations, migrations, misunderstandings, stories that had grown larger than their beginnings, and those explanations were accepted in public settings where acceptance was useful. In private, the same people often admitted that the details did not quite line up, that the interruption still felt too clean, and that the absence still felt too complete. A few years after the last official visit, a traveler returned from the region and said that he had reached the lake by accident, following a route that should not have taken him there. He stayed only long enough to confirm that there was nothing left to see, and yet he said the place felt less like a ruin and more like a room that had been carefully closed. He did not mention lights or tracks or any single detail that could be questioned, only that he left sooner than he had planned and did not look back while he did dot in the end. The village did not become a lesson or a warning, only a quiet reference point for the limits of what can be known from careful observation alone. The records still exist, and so do the stories, and they still describe the same ordinary objects waiting in the same ordinary ways. The only thing that never settled into anything like certainty is whether the people who once lived there walked away together, or whether the place itself, in some slow and patient way, learned how to let go of them.